The night my best friend bet me that I couldn't get her tough, impossible to impress sister to say yes to a date, I laughed. I thought it was just another ridiculous challenge between two friends who had known each other too long to take anything seriously. What I didn't know was that behind that woman's cold stare was a heart that had been broken so badly she had stopped believing anyone could stay. And what began as a stupid bet eventually forced all three of us to confront something none of us had expected. Love was never the real prize. Trust was. My name is Ethan, and for most of my life, I had been the guy people called when they needed someone dependable but never the guy they expected to make a grand romantic gesture. My best friend, Marcus, was the complete opposite. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave 10 minutes later with everyone laughing. His younger sister, Claire, however, was different. She was quiet, sharp, stubborn, and intimidating enough to make confident men suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. She worked as an emergency room nurse, lived alone, and had built a reputation for never needing anyone. Marcus often joked that Claire could stare down a hurricane and make it apologize. I had met her dozens of times over the years, but our conversations rarely lasted more than a few sentences. She always seemed to have somewhere to go, something to do, or a reason to keep people at a safe distance. Then one Friday night, Marcus and I were sitting in his apartment eating takeout when he suddenly looked at me with that dangerous grin I knew too well. He told me there was no way I could get Claire to agree to go out with me. I laughed and said I wasn't interested. He pushed harder, claiming I was scared. 10 minutes later, the bet was made. If I could get Claire to say yes to one date within 30 days, Marcus would pay for my next vacation. If I failed, I would have to wear an embarrassing shirt he designed for an entire week. It sounded harmless. Stupid, even. So the next morning, I bought flowers. Claire opened her apartment door, looked at the flowers, then looked at me. I explained the situation, leaving out the part about the bet because even I knew that would be a terrible way to begin. I simply asked if she'd have dinner with me sometime. She stared at me for several seconds before politely refusing. Then she closed the door. I should have walked away. Instead, I tried again a week later. This time, she refused with a smile. The third time, she told me I was wasting my energy. But something strange happened along the way. I stopped seeing her as a challenge. I started seeing her. I noticed how tired she looked after long shifts. I noticed that she always carried peppermint tea because coffee made her anxious. I noticed that whenever someone talked about their parents, she became unusually quiet. I noticed the little things she did for other people when she thought nobody was watching. One evening, I saw her outside the hospital sitting on a bench beside an elderly patient's wife who was crying. Claire wasn't working anymore. She had already finished her shift, yet she stayed for almost an hour, holding the woman's hand and listening to her fears. That was when I realized Marcus had been wrong. Claire wasn't cold. She was careful. There is a difference. If you believe kindness can heal people, that everyone deserves a second chance, and that sometimes the person who looks strongest is secretly carrying the heaviest burden, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching stories. After that night, I stopped trying to win the bet. Instead, I started trying to become someone Claire could trust. I brought dinner to Marcus's place when I knew Claire would be there, but I never pressured her to talk. When she complained about a broken cabinet at her apartment, I fixed it without making a big deal out of it. When she mentioned that her car was making a strange noise, I recommended a mechanic but didn't insist on taking over. Slowly, the walls between us began to crack. One rainy evening, Claire called me unexpectedly. She said her car had broken down outside the hospital. I drove there immediately. When I arrived, she was standing beneath a flickering streetlight with her arms crossed, rain running down her hair and cheeks. She looked exhausted. I helped her into my car and drove her home. Neither of us talked much. Before she got out, she finally asked me why I kept trying. For once, I told her the truth. I said that at first, there had been a bet. But somewhere along the way, the bet had stopped mattering. I told her I liked being around her. I admired how she cared for people even when nobody thanked her. I admitted that I didn't expect anything from her. I simply wanted her to know that if she ever needed someone, would show up. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said she was afraid of people who promised they would stay. I asked why. She told me about her father. When Claire was 22, her father had promised her mother that he would never leave. 6 months later, he disappeared. No explanation. No goodbye. Just an empty closet and a note that said he needed a different life. Her mother never recovered. Claire spent years watching the woman who raised her become smaller and sadder, until eventually she made herself a promise: she would never depend on anyone enough to let them destroy her. That promise had shaped every relationship she'd ever had. I didn't try to convince her she was wrong. I simply told her that I understood. The next morning, Marcus called me laughing, asking when I planned to collect my winnings. I couldn't laugh. I told him I wasn't doing the bet anymore. He went silent. Then he asked why. I told him because Claire wasn't a game. Marcus immediately apologized, but before we could say more, Claire walked into the room. She had heard everything. Her face changed when she realized I had walked away from the bet voluntarily. She looked at Marcus, then at me. And for the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. She said she had spent the last month wondering whether I was only pursuing her because I wanted to win. She had been waiting for the moment I would get bored and disappear. But now she knew I had already walked away from the prize. That changed everything. A few days later, Claire asked me to dinner. Not because Marcus challenged me. Not because I asked. Because she wanted to. We went to a tiny restaurant downtown where the lights were warm and the windows were covered with rain. We talked for hours. She told me stories from childhood. I told her about my mother and how losing her had taught me that people often don't realize how precious ordinary moments are until they're gone. That night, there was no dramatic kiss. No perfect confession. Just two people sitting across from each other, realizing they had finally stopped pretending not to care. But life rarely gives people happiness without testing whether they are ready for it. 3 months later, Claire's mother became seriously ill. Claire fell apart. She stopped sleeping. She worked extra shifts. She refused help from everyone. She became the woman I had first met again, distant, guarded, determined to carry everything alone. One night, I found her sitting in her mother's hospital room with her head buried in her hands. I didn't tell her everything would be okay. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I simply sat beside her. Hours passed. Eventually, she leaned against my shoulder and cried. She cried for her mother. For her father. For every relationship she had walked away from before anyone could leave her. She cried because she was terrified of losing the last parent she had. I held her hand. And for the first time, Claire allowed herself to be held. Her mother survived the illness, though recovery took months. During that time, Claire learned something she had spent years avoiding. Letting someone help you isn't weakness. Sometimes it is the bravest thing you can do. A year after the original bet, Marcus invited us both to dinner. He stood up halfway through the meal and announced that he had something to confess. He admitted that when he first made the bet, he had thought it would be funny to see me get rejected. He never imagined that his stupid challenge would bring us together. Claire looked at him and laughed. Then she looked at me. Marcus asked whether he should feel guilty. Claire smiled and said that maybe he deserved some credit. I shook my head and told him he didn't create our relationship. He only accidentally opened the door. What happened after that was up to us. 2 years later, Claire and I stood in the same hospital where she had once cried beside her mother's bed. This time, she wasn't wearing scrubs. She was wearing a simple white dress. I was standing beside her, holding her hands. Her mother sat in the front row, smiling through tears. Marcus stood beside me, wiping his eyes and pretending he wasn't. Claire looked at me and whispered that she never believed she would trust someone enough to build a future with them. I told her I never expected to fall in love with the woman I had once been foolish enough to think I was trying to impress. She smiled. And then she said yes. Not to a date. Not to a bet. To a lifetime. The funny thing is, I never won Marcus's bet. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to win anything. And Claire never lost her toughness. She simply learned that being strong doesn't mean standing alone. Sometimes strength means opening the door and letting someone stand beside you. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe for more stories about kindness, love, and the unexpected ways people can change each other's lives. And before you go, leave a comment saying, "Kindness changes everything." If you believe the right person doesn't break down your walls, they patiently show you that you never needed those walls forever. Because sometimes the greatest love story doesn't begin with two people falling in love. Sometimes it begins with one person finally deciding to stay. And sometimes, the most beautiful yes in the world comes only after someone has spent years being afraid to say it. Claire's yes wasn't the prize. It was the beginning.